Now, our next speaker is Dr. Jessica Rhee, who leads the Clinical Trials Office at the UH Cancer Center. She is also an accomplished oncologist with expertise in breast cancer. I have great respect for clinical trials and the folks who participate in them, because that research is what generates improved treatments. I'm grateful for their contribution because I had breast cancer 25 years ago, and I know that such efforts enabled me to be here today. Jessica's a very busy person, but she always wants to be even busier because that means more folks are participating in more clinical trials. Please welcome Jessica.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you all for coming. So today I will be talking about clinical trials, what they are, and why they're important. So I'll be first going over some basic definitions and terms about clinical trials, going over some basic information, convincing you why clinical trials are important, the role that we at UH Cancer Center play in providing clinical trials, dispelling some of the common myths about clinical trials, and discussing some of the really high-impact trials that we have available here. So first, I want to just define what a clinical trial is. So according to the NIH, a clinical trial is a research study that prospectively assigns human subjects to interventions to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related outcomes. And it's really important that the NIH define what a clinical trial is because they have very strict guidelines about how clinical trials should be conducted and reported. So the key term in the definition of a clinical trial is an intervention. And an intervention is defined as manipulation of a subject or the subject's environment for the purpose of modifying one or more health-related endpoints. And there are many, many types of interventions. The one that we most commonly think about are the drugs, the actual treatments to treat the cancer. But there are many other types of interventions that are tested in clinical trials. So this includes devices such as new prosthetics, procedures such as new surgical or radiation techniques, health delivery systems like telemedicine, strategies to change health-related behaviors such as dietary studies, exercise studies, and then other strategies, not just for treatment, but also for preventing cancer as well as diagnosing cancer. So many more clinical trials than just the treatment ones, and they're all equally important. So the clinical trials participants are not just the doctor that's treating the patient and the patient, but there's an entire community of stakeholders that's involved. That includes the patient's caretakers, their entire support system really, the community health care providers, the doctors, the nurses, the office staff, hospitals and healthcare systems where all the testing, procedures are done, insurance companies that provide reimbursements for people that are on clinical trials, government agencies like the NIH, the FDA, and academic cancer centers like UH Cancer Center. So there are many types of cancer clinical trials, the most common one being the treatment ones. But as I said, there are also clinical trials for preventing cancer, better ways to screen cancer, better ways to support cancer patients during treatment, such as trials that test new ways to improve nausea or fatigue or chemo brain. There are correlative laboratory science studies that look for biomarkers of people who are more likely to respond to that treatment. Healthcare delivery trials, diagnostic trials, and more clinical trials are incorporating quality of life into their studies. So not only are we looking at how do these new treatments help patients treat their cancer, but we want to make sure that their quality of life is the best that it can possibly be. Because it doesn't make sense to improve a person's outcome in terms of survival, but make them miserable for the years that they're going to cure the cancer. So pretty much every study now incorporates some sort of quality of life that takes into account. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about treatment trials because these are the most common types of cancer clinical trials. So Treatment trials are answering a specific set of questions. Most commonly, how should the new treatment be given? So should it be given in the form of a pill or an injection, IV infusion? Does the new treatment prolong life? Because that's the ultimate best outcome. Also, does it improve the quality of life? Some studies show that both treatments have similar outcomes, but one treatment is better tolerated, so then that should become the standard of care. What are the new treatment's potential side effects? And does the new treatment prevent the cancer from spreading or returning in the future? So there are some misconceptions about how clinical trials are funded. Some people think that they're really just funded by pharma, and by going on to a clinical trial, you're just making the big companies richer. Well, actually, the federal government is the largest sponsor of clinical trials, the NIH, so $3 billion a year. So that's a significant amount of their budget, and they see cancer clinical trials as a priority, and that's why they fund so much of it. But other entities that fund clinical trials are the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and then, of course, private industry. So the pharmaceutical companies that do bring the newest novel agents that need to be tested, but also medical institutions like hospitals, university cancer centers, and then private foundations such as the American Cancer Society or Susan G. Komen. They provide funding as well. So I'll go over a little bit about the phases of a cancer clinical trial. And this is important because every clinical trial in the title will tell you what phase it's in, and that indicates where in the development of that new intervention is. So the first phase is the preclinical phase, and that embodies all of the studies that are done before the treatment is given to a patient. So many, many years, decades of scientific data, experiments that have been done in the lab, in cells, and in animals, they accumulate a lot of data to show that that new treatment has potential efficacy in a particular cancer and that it is likely to be safe. So once that whole body of knowledge has been obtained, then the next step is we really have to know that it works in people. So that's where the phase 1 trial comes. This is the first-in-man clinical trials. These are small studies, usually less than 50 patients. They usually take a few months to complete. So the basic questions that are being answered in a phase 1 study is the new treatment safe, most importantly, and what is the appropriate dose to determine efficacy. So once a new drug is deemed to be safe and a dose has been found, the best dose has been found, then that study goes on to a phase 2 portion. And in the phase 2 portion of the development of a new treatment, we're really wanting to know if it has any efficacy in that tumor type. So phase 2 studies are a little bit bigger, but usually less than 100 patients, and they take anywhere from a few months to even a few years, depending on how long it takes to get people to enroll onto that study. So phase 2 studies, again, making sure that it's still safe, but also testing for efficacy, making sure that it actually does what it does to the particular cancer type. So if a new treatment is successful, has been shown to be safe and effective in a phase 2 study, then it can move on to a phase 3 study. And the phase 3 study is the gold standard. This is where the new treatment is being directly compared to the current standard of care. So it's a much bigger study, hundreds of thousands of people, and it can take anywhere from years to even decades to complete because these are very large studies and it takes time to accrue all those patients. But if a new treatment is deemed to be better than the current standard of care, then that becomes the new standard. And success in a phase 3 and sometimes in a phase 2 study is what gets a drug FDA approved. So as you can see, this is a very long, intense process before a drug becomes available to the public. Now, once it's FDA approved, it becomes available to everyone. A phase 4 could be done. It's not done very often, but in a phase 4 study, they are testing to see if there are any new unexpected side effects once the drug is available to the general community. So those are the 4 phases. So every cancer clinical trial will always start off with indicating which phase it is in, so you know where in the drug development process that new treatment is. So this is a schema for the most common type of cancer clinical trial. So there is a study population that is defined, and then half of the study subjects are given the standard treatment plus the new investigational drug, and then the other half is given standard treatment plus a placebo. And then both groups are assessed for a response, and those groups are directly compared. So as you can see, everyone gets at least the standard of care. It's just a matter of whether you get the new drug or the placebo. So the same quality of care for everyone in the study. And a little bit about placebos. A placebo is a product that is designed to look exactly like the investigational agent, but is completely inactive. And it's rarely used in cancer treatment trials, and really only when either there's no standard treatment available or when you're comparing it to an investigational agent in a scenario like I just described where everyone is already getting the standard of care. And the purpose of a placebo is to prevent any kind of bias, because just by taking anything, our mind is pretty powerful, and we may report side effects that aren't necessarily to that investigational agent. So it's really important for the study to be valid, to make sure we remove as much bias as possible. And participants are always told if there's a placebo involved in a study. Now, the best study is also involves randomization. So you have a uniform study population, and then the study participants are randomly assigned to one of the two arms. And this is done through a complicated computer algorithm that makes sure that it's completely random. And again, it's to remove any bias in the results. Some phase 2 trials have randomization, and all phase 3 studies have to have randomization. This is how we get the highest quality data possible. So there are certain criteria that are in place to determine who can participate in a study, and this is really to make sure that that safety is always the priority, and that the study populations are uniform so that the results are valid. So these are called inclusion and exclusion criteria. So inclusion criteria are the factors that allow participants to be involved, and the exclusion criteria are the factors that kind of disqualify you from being on a clinical trial. And some of the most common eligibility criteria are age, gender, the type of cancer, stage of cancer, other medical conditions. So for example, if a drug is being studied that we know can have side effects that affect kidney function, we're not going to allow people who already have baseline abnormal kidney function to participate, because then we could potentially make their condition worse. So these eligibility criteria are not to prevent people from joining a clinical trial, but we just want to make sure that that it's done in the safest way possible. And as I said, patient safety is always the highest priority in a clinical trial. And we have federal laws and guidelines in place to make sure that this is happening. Patients are protected by the informed consent process. There's an intense, extensive review by multiple bodies, which includes the Institutional Review Board that is composed of professional as well as lay people that review the study protocol, as well as any materials that the patients may see. And then there is ongoing monitoring of the trial and all of its participants through every step of the process. Just like patients have rights, participants in clinical trials have rights also. They must be always told the purpose of the trial, all the potential risks, benefits, side effects, discomforts, any potential benefits that they may be reasonably expected to know about, what may happen on the trial, what interventions are part of standard of care and which ones are new and investigational. They must be told all of the treatment options that are available to them, and including participating in the clinical trial. They must be allowed to ask questions at any time, given enough time without any pressure to participate in the study. And usually that's not all done in one visit. It takes multiple visits to make sure that the patient and their loved ones are completely understanding what they're being involved in and what to expect. They can refuse to participate at any time for any reason. So even if they're in the middle of their treatment, they can choose to stop for any reason, and they don't have to say why, and they will just continue with whatever the standard care their doctor will provide. They receive a signed copy of the informed consent form, and the informed consent explains the entire study in lay terms, and all of the visits and all the testing that's expected, so that they have as much information as they need to make that decision. And they're told of any potential complications that can occur and how they can be treated. There's a principle called good clinical practice that's in place. This is the international ethical and scientific standards for how clinical trials are conducted. And again, the purpose is to make sure that they are done in the safest way possible, of the highest quality, so that the data is as valid as possible. And as of 2017, anyone that receives NIH-funded support for their clinical research is required to undergo GCP training. So everyone here in the Cancer Center has undergone GCP training, and it's just not a one-time thing. You have to renew it every few years. A little bit more about the informed consent, because this is not just the document that the participant and the investigator signs, but it's really the whole process of explaining the trial, all the things to expect in terms of their care, as well as any testing, financial matters. So making sure that the patient, as well as whoever the caretaker is, fully understand what is needed, what is expected, and then can make an informed decision. And this is very, very important, very time-consuming, but we make sure that everyone is comfortable with the process. Now, when a patient is on a cancer clinical trial, they get an entire team of people that are involved in their care. So it's not just the doctor and the patient anymore, it's an entire team. There's the principal investigator, who is in charge of the conduct of the entire trial, as well as principal investigators that are site-specific for here in Hawaii. There's a research nurse that works with the clinical nurse to make sure the protocol is followed and any unexpected side effects are reported and managed appropriately. There's the clinical research associate, who coordinates all of the study visits and the testing to make sure that everything is done on time and done at the highest quality level. And then we have data specialists, who are responsible for collecting the data that are recorded by all the clinical folks, the doctors and the nurses, and then they report those data points to the sponsor. And then, of course, the treating physician. So when you're on a cancer clinical trial, you have many more eyes on your care. And this is one of the reasons why it has been shown time and time again that cancer patients that are on clinical trial actually have better outcomes than ones that receive standard of care. A common question is, what does it cost to participate in a clinical trial? And we don't ever want this to be a barrier for people. So the costs are divided into routine care costs and research costs. So the routine care costs are all of the charges for treatment of that patient that would occur whether or not they enrolled on a clinical trial. So these are the usual doctor's visits. If you get sick, you get admitted to the hospital, the usual blood tests, the CT scans, and any of the standard drugs that you receive. So all of these routine care costs are billed to insurance. Then there are the research costs. And these are the costs that are related specifically for enrolling on a clinical trial. So if there's an investigational drug, that is paid for by sponsor. If there are extra doctor visits, say if the standard of care is to see the doctor once a month, but the study requires it twice a month, then the twice a month, then every other doctor visit would be paid for by the sponsor. And if there are tests that have to be done solely for the research study, so if there's a special biopsy or a special scan, special blood test that needs to be done, then those would be paid for by the sponsor. So in terms of the participant, really what they're usually responsible for is whatever your usual copay deductible is. But everything else should be paid for by insurance or by the study sponsor. And as of 2004, the Affordable Care Act requires that all health insurers pay for the routine care costs of people participating in a cancer clinical trial. And actually, since I sent in this slide, I have to update it. For nationally, Medicare pays for the routine care costs as well, but the Medicaid system did not uniformly allow that, and so they left it to each state to decide. And Hawaii had been one of a dozen states that did not have a formal policy or a law that allowed routine care costs to be covered. But as of December 2019, we worked with the Medicaid here, MedQuest, to develop a formal policy that would allow this to take place. So this means that the 25% of Medicaid patients who will develop cancer will also have access to clinical trials now. So some statistics about why cancer clinical trials are important. Well, the cancer population in the world is only increasing, and more people will die of cancer. And really the only way to change this is through research. All of the treatments that we have today that are standard of care, they were a clinical trial a few years ago. So that means that the clinical trials that we have available today will become the new standard of care. And the only way that we can develop newer techniques, better drugs, is that they have to be tested in a clinical trial. But we make sure that we do it in the most ethical, safest, and high quality level as possible. So really the way to change the statistic of people dying from cancer is to have more clinical trials, more people enrolled, so that we can get that data quicker than we do now. The benefits of clinical trials are not only for the participant who really can only not access the most novel and newest agents through a clinical trial, but they're also contributing to science as a field. They're helping future patients, and again, they receive the highest quality of care when they're on a clinical trial. They have increased oversight. The treatments are all standardized. The protocol has to be followed to the letter. They make sure that you don't miss any doctor's visit, that you get every test that you need to. You cannot fall through the cracks when you're on a clinical trial. They will hound you at home. They will call everyone that you know to make sure everything is done. And there is quality assurance every step of the way until that study actually closes. So you're followed for much longer. It could be decades, depending on how long that study is open. A few statistics about clinical trials. So for children with cancer, being on a clinical trial is part of standard of care. It is just one of the treatment options that is always presented. So for kids with cancer, 70 to 75% of them actually enroll onto a clinical trial for treatment. And this is why kids' cancers have such a high cure rate, over 80%. For them, it is a gold standard. For adults, only about 3%, 5% at the most with cancer go onto a clinical trial. And this is one of the reasons why adult cancers are not progressing as much as children's cancers. And people always wonder, why aren't we curing more cancers? Why isn't the field moving faster? It's because we need more people to be involved in clinical trials. There are many reasons for this, lack of education. So I go around giving this talk to the community, and I hope all of you have a better understanding and will be advocates for clinical trials. There's also concerns about effectiveness and cost, but these are all barriers that can be overcome, and I hope I've explained those to you today. Some more statistics. So 85% of clinical trials fail to retain enough patients. That means those studies cannot ever make any conclusions, and all of the time and resources have been wasted, and we have no answers to those questions. 80% of clinical trials fail to finish on time, so that means it takes longer to get those results. 50% of sites enroll only one or no patients onto their studies. So a lot of time and resources have been put into trying to make available the clinical trial, and then no patients get on to benefit from it. Clinical trials are so important that 40% of the U.S. pharmaceutical clinical trial budget goes just toward recruiting patients. It is that difficult to find patients for trials. And 30% of patients drop out of a clinical trial for various reasons. Here in Hawaii, we are in a unique situation because we have no ethnic or racial majority. However, most cancer clinical trial participants are Caucasians. So that means the results of those studies really only apply to a small population here. We can't directly translate the results of those studies to our population. So it's even more important for us here in Hawaii to make sure that we enroll as many of our diverse patients as possible so that those results can be generalizable to our population. The NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, is a consortium of some of the top cancer centers in the country, and they get together routinely to review all of the current data and to provide guidelines on how cancer should be treated, but also prevented and diagnosed and managed together. And on every page of the NCCN guidelines, which we consider as the standard of care, this statement is there. It says, NCCN believes that the best management of any patient with cancer is in a clinical trial, so participation is especially encouraged. So even for the NCCN, the standard of care for a cancer patient is to go on a clinical trial if there is an appropriate one available to them. We at UH Cancer Center agree with the NCCN guidelines. We are one of 70 NCI-designated cancer centers. That means we are at the forefront of the NCI in terms of support for research. That also means we are one of the top 4% of the cancer centers in the entire nation, and we're fortunate that we have such a facility here, remotely all the way out here in the Pacific. And we get this designation through a very rigorous and lengthy process by demonstrating that we are scientific leaders, that we have the depth and breadth of the research, that we understand what our community needs are, and we address those needs through research to make a direct impact. And one of the impacts that we make is by providing the clinical trials. So we provide the clinical trials that we get from the NCI as well as from our own faculty that develop clinical trials as well as pharmaceutical companies, and we provide those studies to the public. So we have the infrastructure, the research staff, the regulatory and compliance oversight that we provide. So what is unique about our situation here is that patients that are diagnosed with cancer can continue to be treated by their own community oncologists and have access to the same clinical trials that the mainland folks have. In other institutions where academic centers provide the studies, patients usually have to be referred to the university, and then they have to leave the support of their family and leave the doctor that they've trusted for so long. So we are unique in that we can provide the trials directly to the community, and that's really where most cancer care is done anyway. So we are in kind of an ideal situation here. And recently, disease-focused specialists were hired to be part of the Cancer Center faculty. So now we have GI-focused faculty as well as breast oncologists like myself. So as a part of trying to increase awareness about clinical trials, we started a public education campaign called 20 by 25. So our goal is to increase participation of cancer clinical trials to 20% by the year 2025. And that is a very lofty goal, but here I believe we can accomplish that. And if and when we do, we would be the first state in the entire nation to do that. And this is really how we're going to make an impact in terms of preventing cancer and improving outcomes. Our first phase of our public education campaign were public service announcements over last year, and then this year we're providing written materials like the brochure that I gave you today. So now I'll go over some of the common myths about clinical trials and hopefully dispel them for you. So probably the most common myth is that cancer clinical trials are only for people who have no other treatment options, and that is definitely not the case. Because by the time that happens, that patient might be too sick, their organs might be failing, that they can't even qualify for a clinical trial. And as I told you, we have clinical trials for every stage of cancer, even preventing cancer, diagnosing cancer in better ways. So anytime there's an opportunity for a new treatment, that is a perfect time to consider a clinical trial. Because what we want to do is intervene early so that the cancer doesn't even return, so that you don't need the trials for later stages. So at any time from the time of diagnosis, whenever there's a treatment change, is a good time to consider a clinical trial. Participants are treated like guinea pigs. Well, as I've told you, there are many, many measures, laws, guidelines in place to protect the participant, and that is always the highest priority for clinical trials. There is oversight at every level throughout the entire process, starting from the informed consent, all the way to monitoring that patient under a microscope through the duration of that study, as well as during the many years of follow-up afterwards. And when participants of cancer clinical trials have been surveyed, most of them have said that they received respectful treatment, that their care exceeded their expectations, they would participate again, and they would recommend the clinical trials to others. And many times our patients that go on to one clinical trial, they want to know if there are any others that they're eligible for. Clinical trials are dangerous because they use new medicines and practices. Well, clinical trials are designed for research, so there is some level of risk, but there are also risks to getting the standard of care. But the new drugs have gone through such rigorous testing, and through each phase of the study, they have to be shown to be safe and effective to move to the next step. So the rigorous testing and the scientific review and ongoing review throughout the life of that protocol is critical. And the participants are monitored very closely. And I would argue they're followed even more closely for adverse effects on a clinical trial, because a doctor can't just ask vaguely, how are you feeling? The study folks, the research nurse, and the coordinators, they have to document exactly the name of the side effect, when it started, when it stopped, the severity of it, and whether it was due to the study drug or not. They have to monitor that at every visit. So even if you forget to tell them something, they're going to have it written down, and they have to ask you about it the next time. So much more monitoring. Participation provides no benefit to me. Well, as I've told you, a cancer clinical trial is the only way to access the newest, most novel agents for patients. And study after study has shown that outcomes are at least good, and many times even better than people that receive just the standard of care. And standard of care is a broad term, and really, as I said, the NCCN guidelines are considered one of the standards of care for cancer patients. But we know there are variations in practices. Doctors do many different things, but patients that go under a clinical trial, we know that they're going to receive at least the best standard of care at the time, and that protocol has to be followed. You cannot deviate. A doctor cannot decide not to follow it. If they do, you have to do a lot of explaining and get approvals from a lot of different bodies. I can't drop out of a study without jeopardizing the quality of my treatment. Well, as I said, the participant can choose to stop at any time, before, during, after the informed consent process, during treatment, years later, and you don't have to explain why. And then the same quality standard treatment will be given to you. If there is a clinical trial that might help me, my doctor might tell me about it. Well, this would be the ideal scenario, and this is why I develop very close relationships with all the oncologists to make sure that they're informed about the clinical trials that we have available. We are fortunate here that pretty much all the oncologists are part of our clinical research network. This is outside of the Kaiser system, but the Kaiser system here has a relationship with the National Kaiser Network that provide clinical trials through that mechanism. So all of the oncologists here actually get an email, usually once a month, of all the clinical trials that are available. And our research staff work in those offices and hospitals looking for patients to tell the doctors which patients might be eligible for which trials. So having access to the trials and knowing about the trials is not a problem here. But not every doctor sees cancer clinical trials as a priority for their patients, and that's something that we are always trying to change. So you can't completely rely on the doctor. So we unfortunately have to be advocates for ourselves, for our loved ones. But most of the time, if someone brings up the topic of clinical trials, the doctor is more than willing to engage and to try to help find those trials for you. So some high-impact trials that we have here at the Cancer Center. So this is called the Comet Trial. So this is a study looking at standard treatment for DCIS, so ductal carcinoma in situ, which is non-invasive stage 0 breast cancer. There's a lot of controversy right now whether it is a cancer or not, but we currently treat it like a cancer. So in this study, the participants are randomized into 2 different groups. So the top one, the group 1 is the usual treatment. They would get standard surgery, radiation, and then endocrine therapy, so a hormone blocking pill, and they get mammograms every 12 months for 5 years. Now the interventional arm is the close monitoring. So these patients would not get surgery or radiation and just get the hormone blocking pill, and then they get mammograms more often because they should be followed more closely. So this study is for folks who have low risk DCIS, because we're not sure if we should treat them as cancers. So based on the outcomes of this study, if it shows that people with low risk DCIS do not need surgery and radiation, that would change the standard of care, and that would alleviate a lot of unnecessary treatments that have side effects. Another study is called Lung Map. So this is a complicated slide on purpose because more and more cancer care is precision medicine. So we no longer treat all of a certain type of cancer the same way. It doesn't really matter where the cancer started, it's really the biology of that cancer that's important. So a decade ago, all lung cancer was treated the same way. Everyone got the same chemotherapy, carbotaxol. But we were able to determine that not all lung cancers are the same, that certain lung cancers have certain genetic mutations in them that make them behave differently. And so they were able to develop targeted treatments for those specific mutations. So in this study, for patients with advanced lung cancer, a type of lung cancer, squamous cell, their tumors, so they get biopsied and their tumors are tested to see which genetic alterations are in their tumors, and then they get assigned to different treatment arms based on their specific mutations. So this is complicated because it really is looking at many different subsets. And because it's very complicated, this study requires a lot of participants and it takes a long time. So we need even more people to participate so that we can get these results as quickly as possible. And then I just wanted to highlight this study. This study, another breast cancer example, it was using a new type of testing on the tumor called Oncotype DX. It's a test that was developed to see which women who had very good type of breast cancer, hormone receptor positive, didn't spread to the lymph nodes, which ones really needed chemotherapy and which ones didn't. Because the standard a dozen years ago was for every woman that had a breast cancer over 1 centimeter got chemotherapy. But we knew that 80% of them did not need chemotherapy. We just didn't know which ones they were. So this study assigned women who had the Oncotype DX test on their tumor to various arms to determine who really needed the chemotherapy and who did not. And we were a high enrolling site. We enrolled over 170 patients onto this study. So we had good representation of our diverse population. Because we were one of the high enrolling sites, Dr. Jeffrey Berenberg, highlighted there in red, who is one of our investigators. He is a medical oncologist at Tripler Army Medical Center. He was he was one of the authors of this New England Journal of Medicine article. This paper was published June of 2018, it was presented at a national oncology meeting, and the day after, it became the new standard of care. So very, very high impact. And when this study was being done, the Oncotype DX test was not being covered by insurance uniformly here, so the only way to access this new test was to go on this clinical trial. And just share a personal story. So that's my mother in the middle there with her grandchildren. She died of one of the most aggressive types of breast cancer, HER2-positive breast cancer. But she was diagnosed, unfortunately, just a few years before Herceptin was approved. Herceptin now has changed the natural course of breast cancer and pretty much cures most women with that type. But if those studies had been completed just a few years earlier, she might be here today after receiving Herceptin. So this is a cartoon that kind of embodies how a lot of people think about clinical trials. So the man says, "I just heard there's a drug in trials that might stop my cancer." She says, great. Are you going to volunteer for the study? He says, of course not. Why would I do that? And she says, I wouldn't either. Sure hope they get some results soon. So it really takes everyone to participate in some way. So I hope that today I've convinced you that for cancer patients, the best treatment option is a clinical trial if one is available and appropriate for them. That clinical trial participants do receive the highest level of care. Most adult cancers do not enroll because of multiple barriers, but all of them can be overcome. And that clinical trials not only benefit the participant, but also science and society as a whole. So thank you.
Jessica, there are websites where they can also go and see if their trials are relevant to their own disease problem, right?
Correct. So here at the Cancer Center, we have at our website, uhcancercenter.org, if you go under the patient and families, the Find a Clinical Trial tab, there is a site where you can click in the type of cancer or the stage, the age, and it will have the cancer clinical trials that we have available here. But there are also national websites, the NCI, clinicaltrials.gov, many other resources for finding clinical trials.
Let's give Jessica another round of applause.